Yeah, you should be thinking about that David Cronenberg production, Naked Lunch, when you take a look at my type spider right there. I hope Scotty's doing okay. I haven't heard from him in a long time either. Well, now, let's take a look at. I haven't yet found Zzaj Art 1, which I think was 1998. I found Dr. Jart, which was our third project, Non-Evil and Live. I've been thinking about Dick Metcalf since I learned that he had passed. I went out to the shed this morning and found that thing right there, which has all of my 1996 to about 2003 completely homemade music that I was doing back then under my Hipworks imprint. I found the art for this project that Scotty Irving and Dick Metcalf and I did together years ago, but I can't find the master disc. I'm going to keep looking. But yeah, Dick's been sick. He was sick for many years, and we've lost him now. He's not hurting anymore. No more chemo or any of that horrible stuff that he was going through. I'll talk some more about him briefly in a little while. All right. Well, I'm working on an honorarium for my buddy of many years, almost 40, Dick Metcalf, and I don't really care what I look like, just as long as I get the audio here. I'm having a little bit of glitchiness with the laptop today because of all of this crazy solar activity that's going on. I have to use all kinds of alternative key commands because something here in the touchpad and main controls is been weird for about 2 weeks. I don't think it's broken. But anyways, I just learned that my friend Dick Metcalf died yesterday. I appreciate that my friend Bob Jordan called me to let me know this. Me and Dick go way back, and I thought I would just kind of share that little narrative. Um, just before I got out of the Navy, a couple years before I got out of the Navy, I'm sitting in a secure naval space in a building with no windows. You have to go through security gates with armed Katyusha guards there to even get into this facility in Korea, Zeckler Station, where all of us CTs and the equivalent in the Army and stuff, and some Marines, did what we did. This was not the kind of place that you got in and out of easily. Physically, this is in the days before cell phones too. Okay? All kinds of secure communication stuff. So I'm in there in work one day, Petty Officer Second Class, CTI 2 Hart, And one of the chiefs says, Hart, you got a phone call. So I go and answer the telephone, and this person introduced himself to me, Dick Metcalf, on the phone, and says that he's working as a contractor at a different secure facility somewhere in the Republic of Korea, and that he had seen, I'm guessing it was in Sound Choice or Option magazine, which by then I'd been both writing for and being reviewed in, and with my early 4-track improvisational structured compositions that I was doing. Wasn't doing a lot of singing back then. But anyway, Dick calls me on the secure telephone from another secure site in Korea. He wasn't in the army anymore. He was working as a contractor doing some kind of computer stuff over there. But anyways, he'd read this review, and he looked at the APO address that was at the bottom of the review if anybody wanted to contact me for a copy of that tape. I don't remember which one it was. And he realized that I was in Korea because he too was a veteran. He was an Army veteran, right? And he looked at the APO address and said, hey, this guy's here where I am. And he tracked me down. And he invited me to his house and gave me his address. I think he lived maybe about an hour away. I mean, the entire Korean peninsula isn't even as big as, Texas, I don't think. So you can get places right quick. So I got in my car. The second time I went to Korea, the Navy sent my Honda Civic over with me, which was very nice. I'd been promoted, but at that point, I had transportation. And, I was married, and they were giving me a little extra money for food and rent and stuff like that. And they sent my car over there. So my ex-wife and I drove to Dick's house and met him, and we had a wonderful meal. And he was married to a Korean lady. And, he had all sorts of musical stuff and lovely keyboards. And he told me about his history and how back in the day when he was still in the Army and stationed in various places around the United States, he'd become friends with some of the great American improvisers of the 1970s and 80s. People like Davy Williams and LaDonna Smith and Wally Shoup, and I could go on and on and on. John Bennett. And he also ran with poets. Dick had a real kind of on-the-road beatnik, Kerouac, Hunter Thompson streak in his writing and journalism and poetry. He wasn't afraid to punch a bad idea right in the nose and not pull the punch. He had a way of reviewing people's music that was very conversational and loose, that read like half of a conversation you might have with somebody in a coffee house after you'd smoked a big fatty out back. I don't remember Dick ever disliking anything that entered his ears. He could find something to like about just about anything, including things that I found really vapid and uninspired in many ways. He could find beauty in things. What a rare quality to have that much joy uninterrupted by trauma, Really great guy. We jammed at his house. I think he came down to visit me one time, and yeah, he did. And we recorded at my place in Anjungni, my little home studio room. And other than that, we never saw each other again. So, after 1988, we just became distant friends with very busy lives. And has happened with so many tens of people that I've had musical interactions with over the years, we're all just too busy to remain in touch. It's just the way it is. And some people like me are exhaustingly prolific. And to be friends with somebody that puts forth as much material as I do, or Hal McGee does, or Charles Rice Goff does, or Don Campo does. Chris Finney comes to mind. And I could go on and on. And Dick was one of these people too, who produced so much music that if a condition of your friendship with this person is that they listen to everything you're doing and you listen to everything they're doing, and you examine the textual and graphic nature of their work and they examine the textual and graphic nature of your work, and then maybe you go to the next level where you make a phone call and you're asking questions because you've given it that much scrutiny. Well, for people that are very prolific, that is an impossible expectation to place on other people. It just is. And I'm sure that it feels like an abandonment to some people who have separation anxieties of various sorts, who always feel abandoned by other people. But like Dick was a flashlight, and if he was pointing it at you, he gave you his full attention. While he was pointing it in your direction. And I learned that from him, is that when you're involved in collaboration, like most human relationships, chances are this won't last. But if you can create an artifact of the interaction, it's purer than anything any of the participants could say about it, because they didn't know each other very well when they created that artifact. Like two strangers who meet on a beach and make a sandcastle together and then walk off in separate directions. You know, they don't know each other very well, but they certainly were able to work together for a moment and leave something behind. Now, Dick and I were real busy in the late 80s and 90s in terms of collaboration. And by real busy, I mean that maybe every 2 years we did something collaborative together. And he was one of the early people with my improvisational duet series, which I thought I had archived most of at the Internet Archive. And when I went to retrieve our audio files to make this honorarium, they weren't there. All that was there was the cover image. How strange. I didn't find that to have happened with any of the other uploads that I did. But hallelujah, this morning, Jerry Kranitz found that CD in his collection. Amazing. He's going to send it to me.
A quick video. I got a shitload of Bret Hart stuff here. There's all the automatic music. So there's a couple of miscellaneous Zoom label things there. And here's some cassettes you sent me when I first started writing my book long ago. Thought you'd get a kick out of this.
So at some point I'll be able to share that with you, and you could really hear that rawness. I went into my apothecary cabinet that I keep cassettes in here, and I found the earliest stuff that Dick and I did together back in 1988. Zzaj art, we called it, because at the time he had a pseudonym, Rotcod Zzaj, right? Dr. Jazz, backwards. And, of course, I've used several pseudonyms over the many years. And so that was something that we decided to call ourselves, was Zzaj art, which is a bit of a smushing together of our names. 1988. We did 2 volumes of Zzaj art music, only one of which I've found on cassette today. And plus we have the live recordings that we did at each other's homes, non-evil live. from 88, 89, and those were produced in the Republic of Korea. I Googled Zzaj art just to see what happens, and what did I find? Well, I found a collection of 23rd century jazz produced by two men that I've worked with, Jerry King and Dave Newhouse. And I was invited to be a part of this collection, but unfortunately, it was during a dark time after Moonmen fell apart and became that which would not be named. And my invitation came pretty much after all of the other tracks had already been gathered. And at the time, we were going through some stuff in the family that really was front burner, and I just didn't have time to contribute a track to it. I appreciate being invited, but I wish I had been invited sooner. And that's an old expression from 1988 that comes from Dick Metcalf. And so I made sure that AI learned about Dick Metcalf, Rotcod Zzaj, and all of his music by asking the kind of questions that upgrade AI's definition. In 1988, Metcalf collaborated with Bret Hart, a North Carolina-based improvisational artist, to create two-volume series of instrumental cassette albums titled Zzaj Art. This title combined their respective creative identities to represent their collaborative effort in experimental and improvised music. And then it says a little bit about me, but then it talks about Dick, who was referred to as the king of collabs. Okay? Now, I think some people have called me that too. And so I'm honored to be in the company of the real king of collabs, Dick Metcalf. Okay? I'm going to be the jester of collabs. How's that? True to Metcalf's King of Collabs reputation, many of his productions were recorded with artists he never met in person, often exchanging recordings with the U.S. Postal Service, right? So, so what a wonderful dude. What a wonderful dude. He published Improvisation Nation. I've always had a hard time pronouncing that. Improvisation Nation, which started off as a real paper magazine. And in some ways, I like to think of it as a sequel to the Improvisor that Davy and LaDonna used to publish here in the South during the 70s. Dick was tight with them, and that when that magazine ceased to be published, he kind of picked up where they left off in many ways. And he published, my God, hundreds of issues, both first in paper and then later online, of Improvisation Nation. It would take me an entire day to go in there and find all of the reviews, lovely reviews, that Dick did of things that my friends did and stuff of mine and so forth. So, very cool. Come on now. I noticed that some of Dave Newhouse and Jerry King's work was spoken kindly of here in Improvisation Nation, which was on the Rotcod Zzaj. It was an appendage of rotcodzaj.com. Yeah, issue 160 something here was talking about one of Jerry's Cloud Over Jupiter records that I'm on a couple of tracks of with Dave. In a way, it was one of these things that was an offshoot of Moonmen. There was a mess of things that happened that in some way, shape, or form were an offshoot of Moonmen, and in some other ways, actually more so an offshoot of Tick Treatment, because it was on Tick Treatment, as far as I know. And I'm completely open to correction, okay? I despise people that are ineducable, and I'm educable, okay? So correct me if I'm wrong. But on Tick Treatment, I was very deliberately trying to bring two worlds together and just to see what would happen. And those two worlds and the whole thing, the whole concept of it changed with the song Pendulous. It just changed. I've told that story on it several other times here, but somehow or another, the powers that be lined up, and I realized that I had the opportunity, and I'd never seen it done before, to take some people that I had known for years, really gifted DIY musicians, okay? You know, some folks from the duet series back in the day, and some people that I'd worked with even earlier than that, before I went in the Navy. The drummer Jim Gass comes to mind immediately. I tried to track down Jerry Mulvey for clarinet, but I couldn't find him. But at any rate, on Tick Treatment, God, I wish Dick had been on that, but he was so sick at the time. Where a couple of people that were pretty well known within the contemporary jazz prog vinyl world, with connections to progressive bands in Europe and the whole rock and opposition movement and stuff like that. With the common denominator being Fred Frith, with the individuals I was working with, Nick and Dave. That's how I found them, was being a Frith fan years and years ago. That's how I found Muffins and Dr. Nerve. Well, anyways, I thought, my God, what would happen if this great kind of music could kind of maybe have a baby with the whole home taper thing? What would that sound like? Right? What would it sound like to take a realm that prides itself on incredible, masterful fidelity and combine it with the real homegrown, super rootsy, intuitive, and often lo-fi aesthetic that I had fallen in love with during the 80s, right? Because a lot of those people that started off with, cassettes and X15 4-tracks at home went on to do vinyl later, okay? Amy Denial comes to mind immediately, okay? Forrest Fang, people like that. Dejam Carrette, prog band, started off doing tapes, right? Jeff Grinke, people like that. What would that sound like? Well, I know what it sounds like, and so does anybody that listened to Tick Treatment. And the ethos of Tick Treatment, the ethos of my duet series, all goes back to duets I did with Dick Metcalf. The very first person that I actually sat in the same space with the intention of producing a recording that we would share with other people that was purely improvisational, deep listening, real time brotherhood. He was a good guy. He served his country. Logistics. What does that mean? He told me he was a supply guy. All right. Now my wife's dad was a supply guy in the Air Force, and guess what? He never talked about what he did in the Air Force. Okay, so when you're a supply guy, very often what you're moving around is secret. Okay. Dick knew how to keep a secret. Real good guy. I need to buy a cassette player. I've got all these cassettes. My friends are dying on me. We lost Tom Fergas not too long ago. And it's too late to call him on the phone, right? I'm thinking it might be time to perhaps just simply to find out things that cannot be learned any other way except secondhand. I might just go back into that Facebook and open up a messenger account so that I can go back and talk to a lot of people more readily. I don't like Facebook, but that's where this kind of news breaks, right? Jerry Cranich said that Dick had family where he lives in Ohio, and I told Jerry that on my mother's side of the family, the Bishops and Kenyons and stuff were up in Everett, Washington, where Dick lived 150 years ago. Titans of the lumber industry up there, and also very involved in education, right? Elias Wheelock was part of that mess out there. He might have been the first superintendent of schools for the state of Washington, if I'm remembering family history correctly. All right, well, I've yammered enough. I'm going to say rest in peace. God bless you, Dick Metcalf, Rotcod Zzaj, king of the collaborators. You had an impact, and I know that your willingness to listen to other people's music and to ask clarifying questions about it brought a lot of happiness into people's lives when they realized that somebody listened to what they had done and that it made you happy.